The Democratic-controlled House Ways and Means Committee voted along party lines on Tuesday to publicly release a report on Donald Trump's tax returns, which the former president has long tried to shield. Committee Chairman Richard Neal said that supporting material would be released along with the report, and this development comes at a time when Trump and his aides have always denied any wrongdoing in his tax returns. Here is a look at how the House panel voted.
The Ways and Means Committee has now returned to open session, and the question is on the motion offered by the gentleman from California, Mr. Thompson, to submit the committee report, including all supporting materials. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Doggett.
Aye.
Mr. Doggett votes aye. Mr. Thompson.
Aye.
Mr. Thompson votes aye. Mr. Larson. Yes. Mr. Larson votes yes. Mr. Blumenauer. Mr. Blumenauer votes aye. Mr. Kind. Mr. Pascrell.
Yes.
Mr. Pascrell votes yes. Mr. Davis. Aye. Mr. Davis votes aye. Ms. Sanchez.
Aye.
Ms. Sanchez votes aye. Mr. Higgins. Mr. Brady.
No.
Mr. Brady votes no. Mr. Buchanan.
No.
Mr. Buchanan votes no. Mr. Smith of Nebraska.
No.
Mr. Smith of Nebraska votes no. Mr. Kelly.
No.
Mr. Kelly votes no. Mr. Smith of Missouri.
N-O, no.
Mr. Smith votes no. Mr. Rice. Mr. Chairman?
Aye.
Mr. Chairman votes aye.
The clerk will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, I have 24 yeas, 16 noes.
There being 24 ayes and 16 noes, the motion to submit the committee report to the House is agreed to, and the documents are ordered reported to the House. Pursuant to Clause 2L of Rule 11, without objection, members will have 2 additional days to file with the committee clerk supplemental, dissenting, or minority views. Without objection, the staff is authorized to make technical corrections to the report and to redact sensitive, personal, identifiable information such as Social Security numbers, street addresses, personal identification numbers, and banking information.
So 2 questions, parliamentary inquiry. 1, can you explain what this committee did related to the concerns that the private tax returns right now include personal identifiable information that would be troubling and a dangerous precedent? And our concern is that the committee is not voting on the full documents that will be released to the public. We think that's a significant mistake.
I think that we can assure all that every deliberative effort will be made to make sure that in these instances, all of the questions that you raised will be accommodated, as we outlined earlier, and the staff on both sides, I hope, can find an agreement, or the majority staff will prevail. But we did address those issues earlier.
In our strong view, this committee should always be voting and knowing exactly what we are releasing, certainly in text and to the public. In the second point, maybe a more practical one, can you please advise us now on what, now that these documents will be made public, what members of Congress may say when this business meeting concludes?
Well, I would advise that the speech and debate clause be acknowledged. We did participate in this executive session, and I believe that we have been advised, as I have now for years, and those who are watching from the media will reinforce. I want to say this, after a long process, that this was not about being punitive, it was not about being malicious, and there were no leaks from the committee. We adhered carefully to the law, and my advice to all members of the committee is to acknowledge the realities of the speech and debate clause and be very careful about word selection. With that, there being no further business, the committee stands adjourned. Thanks, Kevin. I understand. I know.
Congressman Kevin Brady from Texas, the committee's top Republican, raised concerns about privacy as the documents could contain information such as Social Security numbers. He said that the analysis had been rushed and that it was premature to assess how thorough a job the IRS had done auditing Mr. Trump's taxes. Take a listen.
We are unified in our concern that Democrats may today move forward with unprecedented action that will jeopardize the right of every American to be protected from political targeting by Congress. Our concern is that if taken, this committee action will set a terrible precedent that unleashes a dangerous new political weapon that reaches far beyond the former president and overturns decades of privacy protections for average Americans that have existed since the Watergate reforms. Our current law was put in place to prevent presidents and members of Congress from targeting political enemies through their tax returns. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court chose not to intervene to stop the flimsy and admittedly partisan Democrat efforts to target former President Trump for purely political reasons. After nearly half a century, the political enemies list is back in Washington, D.C., and we worry this will unleash a cycle of political retribution in Congress. Many of us in Congress believed that the current law was strong enough to protect private citizens against political targeting, but it is no longer. So today, Republicans will fight to protect American taxpayers from this abuse of power. Today, we'll insist a transcript from the secret executive session be published so that American people know which lawmakers in Congress support the power to target political enemies and which side will stand with longstanding taxpayer protection. I can't speculate and won't speculate on what the next Congress and this committee will focus on related to tax returns. I do know a major focus will be on the IRS. The destruction of 30 million tax returns last year, their inability to protect private tax return information, their horrid customer service where millions of people can't get answers and can't get their tax returns, as well as efforts, as we've seen, to impose a bank surveillance scheme on Americans. All of those are troubling aspects of the IRS and will be a focus of investigations next year.
The release of Trump's tax returns marks the conclusion of a nearly 4-year legal battle House Democrats waged against the former president after they took control of the House in 2019. The audit program was important to Democrats because it was the justification they used to obtain the returns in the first place. But the Democratic pursuit was also tied in part to long-held suspicions about Trump's taxes after he would not release his returns while running for president in 2016 or once in office. This is what the Democratic representatives in the panel had to say after the vote.
Part of our proposal as well is to require, through this legislation that I have filed, that the IRS within 90 days of a president taking the oath, with cooperation from the Secretary of the Treasury, the mandatory audit would in fact have to take place and the president would be required to submit the documents for that review. I think that it's fair to say that there's going to be broad support for this, I believe, in the House and the Senate. This takes care of ending any potential confusion or chicanery as it relates to the audit program. It is argued in the reports that one of the problems is that the IRS has the limited, if any, ability to hire the sort of specialists that they need to undertake an audit of a very sophisticated tax offering.
I do think where there's agreement, regrettably, that could have avoided all this, is that our Democrat colleagues would like to find common ground on a bill that would codify the IRS rules that will require by law those mandatory audits, would provide more resources to the IRS in those audits. And then they are proposing some areas that concern us about public disclosure of the IRS notes and process themselves. But the point that we made very clearly is if this seriously was their goal, is to make sure that presidential audit process worked, we would have been more than happy to work with them 4 years ago, where it would not be necessary to establish this dangerous new precedent.